Star Trek Online updated a number of things related to the Borg with the new Star Trek Online Incursion update, and one of those things is actually a new Borg ship. This ship is called the Borg Assimilator, and calling it new has a bit of an asterisk on it, because while it is new to Star Trek Online, it is not new to Star Trek video games, because this was actually originally introduced in the video game Star Trek Armada. If you ever played any of the old Activision-era Star Trek games, you're probably familiar with Star Trek Armada or its sequel, Star Trek Armada 2. It was a real-time strategy game, fairly simple in scope, but I mean, to be expected for the early 2000s, especially a licensed game for the early 2000s. This game still has some relevance today because not only are Star Trek Armada 1 and 2 still available on GOG, but many mods are still keeping this game alive. People are still modding the crap out of both of these games to much success, making a lot of very interesting changes to the gameplay. And more than that, in fact, people have made a spiritual successor to the Armada franchise, because while Star Trek Armada 3 never officially happened, modders went and took it upon themselves to make their own Star Trek Armada 3 by modding Sins of the Solar Empire Rebellion. Genuinely, the only reason I bought Sins of the Solar Empire was so I could play Star Trek Armada 3. Anyway, enough of the history lesson. What I'm here to talk about today is the Assimilator itself, because it dawned on me that it introduces an interesting possibility, because there's always been a section of the fanbase who has been practically foaming at the mouth for more playable Borg ships. Yeah, we've got the Renegade Borg ship, but again, that was, the Renegade Borg, the Borg that followed lore, so that doesn't really give off the full Borg collective vibe. Players have been asking for a playable Borg cube for ages now, but Star Trek Online's never really been able to make it work in a way that actually makes sense for the game, and honestly, I don't know if they ever will, not without making some serious changes to either the ship or the game itself, which I don't see happening. A Borg cube is too big, it turns weird, you never really know what direction it's going to be facing, so it's going to make, maneuvering it very difficult, and it's a load of technical and gameplay issues that make the ship very difficult to turn into a playable ship. But the Assimilator doesn't really have these problems. Now, in Star Trek Online, the Assimilator has kind of replaced the standard cubes in a lot of the critter groups, so where you would normally see a standard Borg cube, instead there's going to be a Borg Assimilator. They did this because they wanted cubes to stand out more. They wanted them to be a bigger threat than they originally were, because, I mean, before this recent update, Borg cubes have always been kind of a joke because they're basically made out of tissue paper, so now Borg cubes are more of a dreadnought level enemy, whereas the Assimilators are the more battleship level enemy that the cubes used to be. Now, looking between the cube and the Assimilator, you'll notice some noticeable differences, both in terms of its shape and its size, because the Assimilator is quite a bit smaller than the Borg cube, so much so it's actually causing some problems with the DPS runs in HSE, because the hitboxes are smaller too. So the Assimilator has a much smaller profile, it's much flatter, so you'd be able to see over the top of it, say if you were in a position like, in a viewpoint where you're playing the ship. Additionally, it's also quite a bit smaller than the cube, so again, you're not going to be blocking the entire screen with just the back end of your ship. And another thing about the Assimilator is that it doesn't fly like a typical Borg ship. It doesn't, kind of move, left to right, up, down, in any direction without physically turning like a cube or a sphere does. It moves more like the Borg probes do, where it's, there's a distinct front and back, and it'll fly like a typical ship that we normally see in Star Trek. And because of how the ship is laid out, it actually has a distinct front and back section, so you could easily tell which direction you'd be flying in. So I'm genuinely wondering if the Assimilator is going to end up being a playable ship one day. Now, I want to be clear at this point, this is just speculation on my part, but I genuinely think it'd be a really good idea for Cryptic to introduce the Assimilator as a playable ship, because, I mean, like I said earlier, there is a certain section of the player base that has been practically foaming at the mouth for more playable Borg content. I doubt we're ever going to see a cube or a sphere just because of the difficulty and how they move and getting that to translate into a player ship. And, there's also the size difficulties with the cube. Yeah, there's the probe, but, I mean, who wants to fly a probe? I'm sure there's, like, 2 of you who are like, no, I want to fly the probe. No one else wants to fly a probe. That's dinky and unimpressive. Who cares about the probe? But the Assimilator, that has potential there, because again, it doesn't have the problems that the other Borg ships have in terms of like gameplay design, and at the same time, it's also got this unique form of nostalgia that Stowe has been tapping recently in the form of older Star Trek games. I mean, first we got the Valkyrie fighters from Star Trek Invasion, then we got the what Star Trek Online is calling the Kodai phasers, which are from Star Trek Starfleet Command 2, and now we're getting the I mod, which that's from Star Trek Elite Force. You could also throw in the console from the Tier 6 Steam Runner, because that console was inspired by what the Steam Runner does in Star Trek Armada, which in that it's kind of a long-range artillery ship that fires tricobalt torpedoes. And what the console does on the Tier 6 Steam Runner is that it fires a crap ton of tricobalt torpedoes. Oh, there's also the legendary Daredek skin. That's from the TNG Judgment Rights. That's what that's from. So yeah, clearly Star Trek Online is willing and able to tap these older Star Trek games for ideas for content and stow. And again, the Assimilator, it just seems kind of like an obvious choice at this point for a playable ship. That way they appease the people clamoring for more Borg content, but also appease the people who are really interested in more content from the older Star Trek games. So it's kind of a win-win for them, especially considering the model for the ship is already made. So all they have to do is port that into a playable ship and then make some stats for it and a console and trait. I say all they have to do. I don't mean to devalue that work. I'm sure that's also a lot of work, but I mean, some of the work's already done, so they may as well just keep going and make it into a playable ship. Seems obvious to me. Of course, I'm not a game dev. Things that are obvious to me might not be obvious to them, or maybe even feasible. But at the I'm not gonna get into that discussion because we all know where this is gonna go. But yeah, playable assimilator is what I'm trying to say. It seems like a good idea to me. Sorry, I got a little rambly there, but yeah, let me know in the comments if a playable assimilator is something that you would be interested in. I feel like I'm just opening myself up for a bunch of people yelling at me that it better not be a lockbox ship, so I want to make this clear right now. I don't make those decisions. Stop yelling at me about it. Anyway, like I said, if you're into the idea of a playable Borg Assimilator, let me know in the comments, particularly if you're someone who has been clamoring for more Borg content. Is this something that you would be cool with, or are you still like, ride or die for the cube? Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit the join button to become a member, or hit the super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store in the video's description. If you're ever shopping on the Epic Games Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. Doesn't cost you anything extra, but it does help me out, and I do appreciate it. That is content creator code STU1701. Either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time. People are gonna yell at me about the playable Borg cube again, aren't they? Seriously, guys, it doesn't work. All your little what ifs, or they could just, they're not gonna convince me otherwise. You're not gonna change my mind on this. The playable Borg cube does not work. Anyway, back to the outro.